We wish to honor all the many Métis, Inuit, and First Nations whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. We acknowledge that the ancestral and traditional lands on which we record this episode are Treaty 6 territory, a traditional meeting ground for many Indigenous peoples, and in particular our neighbors, Paul First Nation, Enoch Cree Nation, Alexis Nakota Sioux Nation, and Alexander Cree Nation, on whose territory we work, live, and play, and on whose territory we stand. Dear listeners, I wish to alert our audience that this episode may contain scenes that can be disturbing for some listeners. These scenes include violence against children and graphic violence in general. For more information, please see the description, which will include time codes so that you can skip over the worst of it. Thank you very much for listening, and enjoy the show. The Kanaka Nomicon is an ancient tome concealed deep in the wilderness of Red Canada, guarded by an army of Soviet elites. We bring you the darkest tales from within its leathery pages. Prepare as I, Junior, and my special guest,
Blake Weatherly,
bring you tales from the Kanaka Nomicon. So how you doing, Blake?
Doing good, man. Thank you for having me on the show. This is a crazy story.
Yeah, it's a wild topic.
I gotta throw a little shade though, for your listeners, because originally you had me coming on to talk about some really fun alien stuff going down in your neck of the woods, and I'm gonna throw you under the bus here. Then you hit me up and you're like, no, bro, we're switching topics, and I was like, okay, that's fine. And then you send me this, and I'm like, no.
Yeah. So my original guest for this episode, we had a bit of a schedule conflict. We had to switch things around a bit. So I've got you, Blake, here from Tap Snaps, coming
Yes,
on my
sir.
show. Because my dad dared to go camping. He missed Slammiversary last night.
It's inexcusable.
It is. And I had one of my guests showed up. So she's now officially mine and my wife's best friend because she actually came. Everybody else canceled last minute.
Oh yeah, I got this thing going on, and I got I lost the keys to my car, so I'm kind of in a bad place. Just everything's going wrong. I know.
Yeah,
The same thing happens when I try to throw a viewing party for this video game called Dota 2. They have their big tournament, the international, and I'm like, everyone come over and watch video games with me. And they're like, that's the thing, there's a lot going on, the economy's in shambles. It's just, I'm just not going to make it.
Oh,
So
well.
I get where you're coming from.
Yeah.
But yeah, but that being said, man, I really appreciate you having me on, because I am excited to delve into this, because even though, this doesn't deal directly with aliens, so to speak, there is like kind of a really weird kind of supernatural element to this story.
There really is, and it's one that's become very popular in our culture recently. But even so, a lot of people haven't actually heard this particular story.
Let's go ahead and jump us into it, man, because I know everyone's waiting, everyone's waiting to hear about this. Go ahead and introduce this so everyone can be on the same page.
All right. So the first legal hanging in Alberta occurred in 1879 on December 20th. It would have been a cold winter day. Fort Saskatchewan was, at this time, still a fairly isolated fort located on the North Saskatchewan River. We lack a lot in terms of records for that time period in terms of Alberta's weather, but 1879 was known for being a particularly harsh winter in Vancouver, where fuel shortages were becoming an issue. Granted, that was very far away, but generally if Vancouver is having a bad winter, Edmonton and Fort Saskatchewan are often having an even worse one, being so far inland. At this time, Alberta was still very much a frontier province. Amenities were few and far between. Even Edmonton was little more than a trading post and some farms.
Well, I gotta admit, when I first started seeing these names pop up, I realized that my Canadian geography was severely lacking. And when I looked into Alberta, I noticed that Edmonton was kind of towards the middle of Alberta.
It is.
And so during this time period, I don't think this can be understated. You're talking about a bad winter, but we're talking about a bad winter like in the backdrop of somewhere where logistics, supplies,
virtually non-existent.
Yeah, so they're virtually non-existent, and it's a really bad winter. So this is just really bad.
Yeah.
I think one of the key words we should use here is isolation.
Yes. Well, even nowadays, Edmonton is pretty isolated. We are one of the farthest northern cities of our population in North America. Even Anchorage, I think, is technically farther south because it's further down south on Alaska, which actually goes pretty far down the BC coast. I might be wrong on that. I have to double check.
No, I mean, that sounds about right to me. Y'all do, I think geographically speaking, y'all are higher. And and even then, I imagine the topography is a little bit different too. So, taking into account a harsh winter plus natural barriers, that type of isolation is kind of frightening in of itself, removed from everything else.
And Fort Saskatchewan's even more so. It's not too far from Edmonton nowadays, but back then it would have been several days to get there from Edmonton. Later on this story, we go ahead.
I was gonna say, but of course, it was kind of like you mentioned in your earlier remarks. The even though this place was remote and far removed from, I guess, what we would consider kind of Western civilization, it did have a natives people that were well versed in the land and had been living there perceivably a long time. Yeah,
the Cree had been in this particular area. In fact, the criminal that they were hanging was a man named Swift Runner. He was a Cree First Nations man who was a known drunk and a rabble rouser. Even so, no one really expected the severity of the crime he committed. Swift Runner was found guilty of the murder of his wife, 5 of his 6 kids, his mother-in-law, his brother, and worse, he was also guilty of eating their corpses, leaving only bones behind. We knew he was guilty. He had confessed to the crimes himself, and we had the bodies. He said that he had been possessed by a cannibal spirit, a Wendigo, or as the Ojibwe of southeastern Canada and northeastern U.S. call it, and as you most likely know it as, a Wendigo.
So, first off, this is nuts. This is absolutely bonkers. But what's really interesting to me is the etymology of Wendigo. How it translates to Wendigo, and how essentially a Wendigo in the United States is essentially an accepted cryptid. It's very strange, especially when you get into kind of like Skinwalker Ranch.
Yes.
And a lot of our Native Americans here in the States, they all have their own very unique kind of take on what you would call what I would call essentially a paraphysical phenomena, as a purist. And it seems a lot of these different cultures are all talking about the same thing, and they all have different names for it. Yeah. But a lot of the etymology, like I said, is rooted in the Witico and the Wendigo. And I mean, this stretches, this story coming, all across, all the way down to the deserts of the United States.
Well, and what I thought was interesting, so you're mentioning a lot of the etymology and stuff. So we have the Wendigo of the Ojibwe, the Witico of the Cree, Wet'suwet'en of the Athabascans, which are another Alberta. They're in Alberta, in the more further north. The Jiwakwe of the Wabanaki, the Mahuwe of the Lenape, and less similar, but still in the same vein, we have Stonecoat, which is a cannibal giant in the Iroquois legends, and the Métis loup-garou. So, do you know what Métis are?
No, I'm not familiar with this.
So, Métis are a indigenous peoples in Canada that resulted from French, most often, sometimes British, but mostly French, who took First Nations wives, usually Cree, and they've actually developed their own entire culture. And so they have the loup-garou, which actually combines a lot of the loup-garou myths from France with Wendigo myths from North America. And they kind of create what nativelanguages.org calls a ice werewolf.
It's a fascinating merger of cultures.
It is.
That's so incredible. Well, one thing I'd like to point out, I was doing a little bit of research on this because I came across this in a popular television show called The Terror, which is based on a book, The Terror, the story of, I believe it's called Erebus, which were two British vessels that were basically trying to find...
Yes.
Yeah. And they're stalked by a similar... I'm sorry, go ahead.
Before you get too far into that, if you actually listen to my episode on histories, mysteries, and conspiracy theories that comes up in July 23rd, I believe is when she said it'll be released, I talk about the Erebus and the Terror because that was the Franklin expedition.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I'm excited for that episode because that in of itself is a truly awesome story. So I look forward to hearing that. But what's really interesting is there's kind of a distinction in some of these cultures where you have the Wendigo, the Wicked. I don't want to butcher these names, but you listed them earlier and you sounded lovely doing it. I do not have a knack for pronouncing things like that, but there seems to be this distinction where you have Wendigo style creatures who are basically seen as evil.
Yeah.
They're monstrous. And it's depending on the culture, it's like they were a shaman that practiced in dark magic, or they were cursed, or they performed some type of just unforgivable sin, and this is a punishment put on them. But then you also have similar I guess quote unquote creatures, cryptids, whatever you want to call it, that are more benevolent.
Yes.
They may be shape shifting, but they're not necessarily a monster, quote unquote, which is what we saw in the book and the TV series of The Terror, which was the creature that was stalking them. I believe it's fictitious. It's kind of an amalgamation of a bunch of different. It was called the Toonbach, and it comes from Inuit folklore.
Oh yeah, there's the Inuit folklore is a thing in and of itself, because they were such an isolated people compared to a lot of the other First Nations, that they have an entire whole plethora, pantheon of mythological creatures, a lot of which I talk about a few of them in my Nahanni Valley episodes, because some of that comes in there, though they're mostly Dene in that region. But it's interesting you mentioned that a lot of these are curses. Really, with the exception of Stonecoat, all of these legends share some similarities in terms of how you become them. The loup-garou stands out a bit because you can become a loup-garou by not following Lenten fasting laws. Because they are a French Catholic community.
That's fascinating.
It really is. But most of them involve a human transforming into this kind of hideous creature or being possessed by a spirit after being driven to some form of extreme depravity. Most commonly, it's breaking the great taboo of cannibalism. In other cases, it's insatiable greed that overcomes a person, causing what they would call bad medicine to turn their heart into a block of ice. Still others, it's caused by being overwhelmed by an animal spirit. The result, though, is ultimately the same. The creature becomes something other than human, a monster, killing those who are closest to them.
That resonates really strongly too, because when you talk about like insatiable greed, when you look at this guy's Swift Runner, it's almost like he had insatiable hunger. I mean, eating, cannibalizing and eating, 5 people.
More than 5.
Excuse me, six. It was 6 people.
6 or 7, yeah.
I mean, that's unreal. It's so macabre. It's so macabre and alarming. And I mean, I kind of see why, up until this point, Alberta being essentially the Wild West of its time during this time period, that they were like, you know what, we got to hang this guy. Like, and I thought, yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
I get it. Yeah, it makes sense. But the underlying principles of this kind of weird mythology underlying this, and the fact that he said he was possessed by this spirit, is so alarmingly strange.
Well, and he must have truly believed that, because there are reports that he actually told his captors, the people who are holding him in prison, "Give me a tomahawk and I will save the hangman the trouble."
So he felt like he in of himself knew he was irredeemable. He knew he was possessed and wanted to. Wow.
Before they hung him, he thanked the people who caught him and tried him. And then he actually chastised his captors for keeping his cell too cold, and then went up and let them hang him.
Jeez.
Yeah. It's a wild story. It's interesting. The Wendigo myth is similar in a lot of ways to the old European pre-Dracula vampire myths. In those myths as well, it's usually a great sin or a deep evil that transforms a person into something that's more like a wild beast. It's kind of a reversion of the domesticated human to something wild and dangerous.
It's really interesting seeing those parallels across oceans and continents that seem to be rooted in this this moral code.
It's like this fear of going back to the way things were before human civilization. This fear of becoming animals.
Right, where it's like we're better than that. We don't eat each other. But humans are better than that.
Exactly. In the late 19th century, northern Alberta was actually overcome with reports of Wendigos. People were being dragged out of their homes and killed on suspicion of being one. Almost all of the cases seem to have been the result of kind of a witch panic. This is really the only one where we have a confirmed report of genuine, what we often call Wendigo syndrome, or an actual case where he actually did kill and eat people. A lot of the reported Wendigos in northern Canada at the time were often people who were afraid that a family member or somebody had become one. And there were people who would actually go around and kill suspected Wendigos. That it was kind of held up as a sort of like an exorcist role. There are also ways that you could remove the spirit without killing the person. I actually, when I was doing some mission work on the west coast of British Columbia with some isolated tribal groups out there, we were kind of doing a cultural exchange, and they sang what they call a cannibal song with us, which is a song that you would use to drive out a cannibal spirit.
That's unreal. I'm sorry, I'm a little flabbergasted because there's so many similarities that we've seen in some of the Native American populations in the United States, where very similar things have happened, where we've almost had these, like, I mean, I don't want to like demean them by comparing them to kind of a Eurocentric idea, but basically a Salem witch trial.
Well, it's a witch panic. You get those all across cultures.
But in this case,
Yeah.
it's over the same thing where it's this
Yeah.
idea that's like they're a Wendigo, and it's like, well, how do you know that? I saw him outside. He had a wolf's head on, and he ran on all fours and started howling at the moon. Therefore,
Yeah.
he is actually a Wendigo, and he must be put to death. And then, of course, like a mob shows up and they drag him
Yeah.
out of his house.
Yeah.
It's so strange to hear you talk about this history in Alberta in the 1880s, or excuse me, the early
1878, close enough.
and then there's historical accounts of that happening in the United States well into the 1950s.
Well, you guys
the
had
very similar things.
You guys had a vampire panic. It was way more widespread. Like the Salem witch trials are pretty isolated, but the vampire panic in the United States was widespread. People were digging up corpses and like shoving stakes in them because they were afraid of vampires.
Yeah,
like,
that's there was a old joke we used to have when we were talking about where people, at least back in the day, there were so many instances of people being buried alive where they would be ill or in a coma or otherwise incapacitated to the point that they couldn't open their eyes and say, "Hey, don't bury me. I'm not dead."
Yeah.
And
no doubt.
and they would get buried, and we discovered this because there would be floods, or there would be burial graves removed to be moved into like a mausoleum, or otherwise there would just be grave robbers, and they would be digging up these graves and bringing up these caskets, and there would be scratch marks on the inside.
Yeah.
And people were like, "Holy shit!" And it was a really big deal. So they started attaching bells. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this.
That was it was Edgar Allan Poe's biggest fear. He designed his whole crypt so that it could be opened from the inside in case he got buried alive.
Just in case.
Yeah.
But yeah, I used to make the joke like I would have loved to have had the job of just sitting out there and listening for someone buried 6 feet under to start ringing a bell.
Oh God!
And then of course it'd be like you dig them up and then you shoot them with a shotgun and then bury them back, because clearly this is of the
He's
devil.
He's a vampire.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hangings had not legally occurred in Alberta before this date. The Cree chiefs and Métis leaders in particular were nervous about the practice of hanging. There had been rumors spreading that it was a terrible practice and that it was vile and torturous. And I should point out, it's not that the Cree were opposed to capital punishment. They just didn't know what hanging was like compared to their version of it, which normally was just killing somebody with a tomahawk.
I was going to say like a blow to the back of the skull or a blow to the back of the head, something swift and painless.
Yeah. So the British wanted to show them that it wasn't any worse than their own method of executions, which, like I said, usually involved a tomahawk. But who to hang? Let's be honest, Swift Runner was kind of the perfect candidate. He stumbled into their laps when he turned himself in, or was reported, or I don't know. As we'll get into it, there's like several different stories as to how the RCMP caught on to him. But he ultimately confessed, and in 1879, Swift Runner would be the candidate for the first hanging in Alberta.
I can't imagine there was too many people coming to his defense. Like I can't imagine a public defender took time from trapping or doing whatever they do in the frontier of Alberta to come, argue for the civic virtues of Mr. Swift Runner in light of his egregious crimes.
And the fact that he confessed.
Yeah, but this guy seems enigmatic of himself.
Yeah. And so who was Swift Runner? That's actually a really good point. He was a bit of a mystery. And what drove him to such depraved acts? Was this a case of starvation with cannibalism as a last resort? Was the winter too harsh? Was he too far from food? Like we said, Alberta was a very isolated place. Or was it, like he said, a spirit that possessed him and drove him to kill all his relations? and eat their flesh to feed a greedy, violent hunger within him. Swiftrunner was supposed to be a hunter. He was a big man. He was over 6 feet tall. He was about 6'2", and 200 pounds.
He was a Goliath of a man.
He was. And he had the build for hunting in the unforgiving wildernesses of Alberta. Like Mike Mountain Horse, who I did an earlier episode on, Swiftrunner actually served as a guide for the Northwest Mounted Police, and even for a time made a living for himself as a trapper and hunter.
Well, so I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
yeah.
to me that immediately dispels the kind of argument that he was without food or that he was starving. I mean, he's a guide for the Northwest Mounted Police, which means, and as a native, he knows this land so well.
Yeah.
He's a hunter and a trapper. I have hunted. I've never trapped, but I will tell you this: every trapper I've come across has never looked emaciated.
No,
it's one of the two. Usually, you are both a hunter and a trapper, and you don't go hungry.
No, and he brings it up in one of his accounts that he had fallen ill and was unable to go out and trap and hunt. And
okay,
but as we'll see, there's a lot of questions, and I'm going to be honest with you. I don't think he was starving, because first of all, he ate close to 8 people.
That yeah, and like, also a man of his size, it's not like if you had a 5'5", 130-pound man starve.
Yeah.
After a day he would be starving. A man as big as him could go a couple of days, probably 3 to 4 days without food, just because of, by virtue of how big he is, the fact he has so much weight and fat on him. And that's exactly the type of body type you have to survive in this type of environment.
Exactly. And I, as we'll get into his story, I think he might have had some level of brain damage from drinking. Like Swift, as one newspaper at the time pointed out, and as he said, his contact with white men ruined him. Swiftrunner was inordinately fond of whiskey. So this was before the Indian Act, the most wonderfully named piece of legislation in Canadian history.
Goodness gracious.
Was amended. When the Indian Act was amended, it actually prohibited the sale of alcohol to First Nations people. But at this time, it was actually considered bad practice to sell alcohol to the First Nations. Missionaries and traders in particular were not allowed to sell it. Still, it found its way into the region easily enough, most often as quote-unquote medicine.
Right, which is how I use it.
Oh, good. He drank a lot of it. And he earned a reputation as a, quote, ugly customer to meet when on a spree.
I have also been described in these terms.
Yeah. He was not a small man. He was 6'3", built like a bear, and had a reputation as an angry drunk. He would get into fights everywhere he went and was known as a, quote, terror of the whole region. This is what ultimately got him actually kicked out of serving with the Northwest Mounted Police. They kicked him out to go live with his tribe for a while, but then his tribe kicked him out.
So basically the Mounted Police were like, you need to go to rehab, you need to find yourself, go back to your people. And he goes back to his people, and they're like, dude, you are way too much, get out of here.
Exactly. That was exactly it. That said, there were never any reports of him mistreating his wife or kids. And in fact, later reports say he was really good with kids. And getting kicked out seems to have mellowed him a bit. But this penchant for alcohol may have been at least partially exacerbated by trauma. And I think this trauma in particular is what leads to what happens later. If you follow Wendigo myths, it often starts when you are forced to cannibalism. One winter, a particularly bad one, Swift Runner had gotten trapped in a storm with his scouting partner. His partner had succumbed to the cold, and without any food or supplies to get back, Swift Runner was stuck where he was for weeks. The only thing he had to fend off starvation was his tracking partner. Giving in, Swift Runner apparently eaten parts of his companion's body before the weather let up, and he was able to make it back to civilization.
So that's very similar to like when you get into the Donner Party.
Yes.
Here in the States, where they encountered essentially line for or plot point for plot point this exact same scenario.
Yeah. That's often how it starts, and that's how it is with cultural taboos.
Yeah, but it's like you mentioned though, there is something to be said about kind of the mystical spiritual side to this. Whereas the Donner Party were likely devout Christians for the most part. But however, in the Christian mysticism, you're not necessarily cursed as a Wendigo. I mean,
No.
perceivably it is inexcusable and exceptionally taboo. But I don't know if it necessarily holds the exact same stigma as his culture would have.
No, and this is, I think, part of why they have things like cannibal dances and methods for which to expel this evil and to reinforce the taboo. So if you because their conditions in where they live can be so grim, and sometimes you're forced to this sort of action, their culture has a way of kind of bringing you back into the fold and purifying you.
Which in Christianity we would see this in like confession and absolving you of your sins.
Exactly. Yeah. And in their culture, it would be something like a cannibal dance or a ritual that would brings you back into the fold. And I don't think Swift Runner ever got that. It's
interesting.
It's as much a big part of like psychological healing after trauma as well. Is finding a way to bring yourself back into the fold, back into normal civilization, and to be able to heal and deal with what happened.
That's a fascinating way of looking at it too, because in even in ancient Greek society, when you read the writings of Socrates, he talked about how, of course this is in a lot of ways kind of pre-Christian, but he spoke a lot about how confessing and paying your penance, essentially owning and taking your punishment was healthier for you than the people punishing you. That in this way atoning was a sign of extreme character growth. So it's really interesting you point that out, that they do these things not to normalize the behavior, but in a way to forgive you, and by you taking part in it to allow you to forgive yourself.
Exactly.
And that's fascinating.
And it's a huge part of having a functioning society.
I agree.
It's being able to bring people back into the fold, not just ostracize them.
So Mr. Swift Runner is a raging alcoholic. And so much so that even the mountain police, the mountain force that he was working with, which I'm sure they loved their whiskey too. There was just there was just a few times where he walked them in a circle that they were like, this isn't working out for us. This has been fun.
Yeah.
And but so he gets kicked out of them. He gets kicked back out of his own culture, his own people.
Yep.
So what happens next?
Well, he was married. He wasn't, like I said, he wasn't known for abusing his wife and children. After getting kicked out of the Northwest Mounted Police and off his reserve for his drunken behavior, he did apparently settle down. He was still definitely an alcoholic, but his rages during his drunkenness had more or less simmered. The winter, and we're going to skip a bit here, get a little bit ahead here. The winter of 1878 was not known to be a particularly harsh one. It was, according to the Catholic priests in St. Albert, at least one account that I found, which is between Fort Saskatchewan and Edmonton and was a predominantly French community, it was indeed a fairly mild winter. This might explain Father Kemis's suspicion of the large, well-fed man who came into the mission claiming his family had starved to death. The same man who would wake up the entire mission house in the middle of the night when he shot up in bed screaming. He was good with kids, we're told in T.W. Patterson's book Outlaws of Western Canada. Swiftrunner came into the mission in March of 1879. He was a haunted man. He spoke of his family starving to death after his mother-in-law and brother had disappeared while hunting. Of his 6 kids wasting away, and his wife committing suicide via shotgun. They had been on a hunting trip in the Sturgeon River area. The Sturgeon River, they call it a river. It's more of a swamp that kind of runs north of Edmonton and up into Fort Saskatchewan and along that region. They left in the fall of 1878. They hadn't found any real game and had been subsisting off squirrels and mice that they were able to entice with the few crumbs of food they had. But then the snows fell, and even these meager scraps were denied them. So you're from Georgia. I don't know what winter's like in Georgia.
It's nowhere near this bad.
Yeah.
I mean, we have had winter. Snow is incredibly rare here, but we do have bitter cold winters. But even then, when you talk to hunters and trappers in this area, everyone knows how to adjust in winter.
Yeah.
I live in Macon, Georgia, which is just south of the capital, Atlanta. And I mean, I know we call them good old boys.
Yeah.
They have a lot of names, hicks, hillbillies, whatever you want to call them, that they hunt year round depending on what's in season.
Yeah.
These are the kind of people you go to their house and they open their freezer and they're like, all right, man, let's see, I got some pheasant. I've got some, dove. I got a bunch of deer meat. I got more deer meat than I know what to do with.
Yeah.
And then when you kind of move into South Georgia and what we call NOFLA, Northern Florida, you get the trappers, because in swamp, at least in my experience down here with these people, like I said, I've never trapped, but in swamp areas there is a considerable amount of trapping because of the humidity and the topography. It's so laborious to hunt.
Yeah.
Yeah, to actually hunt. So what they do is they make a trap. They make a trap.
Yeah,
loop.
that's not too far off of why you would trap in a place like Alberta. Now, to trap in Alberta, you actually need a commercial license, so it's not that common, because most people who trap do it as a living up here. But one of the problems we have in winter is when we get a heavy snowfall. So it can drop as low, and back then it was a lot more common, but it would drop as low as -40, which I don't actually need to translate for you because it's the same in both Fahrenheit and Celsius.
Yeah, we would die. we would not survive. We would not survive that. The coldest it gets here is maybe in the teens, 13 degrees Fahrenheit, which again, I'm not sure how that translates to Celsius because I am a product of the United States public education. But I mean, it's just below. I would say just below freezing, below freezing.
About 20 is, I believe, freezing in Fahrenheit. That's zero.
But negative, but negative degrees Fahrenheit
is cold.
Is very cold, and we don't experience it here.
Yeah. One of the problems we have is that when it gets cold like that, and then we get deep snow sometimes, and that deep snow is actually the bigger problem for hunters. The cold you can manage, you just put on more layers, but that deep snow will actually drive deer out because they need to get through the snow to forage. Otherwise, they're just kind of scraping bark and whatever few leaves are left on twigs and stuff.
And you're and it also makes you immobile, so you can't necessarily follow them.
Again, you have things like snowshoes to kind of slightly deal with that, but it's still, like you said, it's laborious and hard. It's a lot like moving through a swamp. I think that's a pretty good comparison. So at that time of year, you will see a lot more trappers. But when the snow gets deep like that, a lot of our small game hibernates. Rabbits don't, but squirrels will. Mice sometimes do, depending on the type of mouse.
And then, of course, the seasonal birds will move out.
Yeah, we don't get a lot of birds aside from songbirds, like chickadees will stay.
And those aren't really good eating.
No, owls will stay, but they're hard to find.
We'll see what's really interesting here in Georgia. Not to go too far off of an aside, but we actually have in our military force, they do jungle training.
Yeah.
And jungle warfare training and survival. They actually do that in the Everglades in Florida.
Yep.
And what's really, it's actually, to me, it's kind of hilarious because, the United States military is all walks of life.
Yeah.
I mean, you got people from New England, people from the Midwest, people from the West Coast. But then every now and again, what's hilarious is you'll get someone in there that's actually from the area, people that grew up in the swamp, and they drop them into the Everglades, and they have a pocket knife, a flint and steel. They give you a pocket knife, a flint and steel, and you got to survive for 5 days.
Yeah.
And the guys from the area come out of this training, and they've gained weight from how much they've been eating.
Yeah.
And 9 times out of 10, it's because they're trappers.
Yeah.
And they're so good at it that, I mean, it's unreal how much properly knowing how to trap, knowing the land, and knowing the movement, migration, the topography, how to conserve your energy, how to run a trap line. Like these guys are just loaded with food.
Well, in getting back to our story, Swift Runner was a skilled trapper and hunter, as far as I'm able to tell. Although I think a lot of his skills degenerated because of alcohol abuse. I think he just got kind of lazy and tired from basically being drunk all the time.
I mean, yeah, that'll do it.
Yeah. So Swift Runner left after his family, according to his story, died, and found his way to the Catholic mission in St. Albert. Father Kemis didn't buy it, according to this account, but the other fathers did. They encouraged him to stay until he felt he could leave. Swift Runner, the hulking man that he was a seemingly gentle man. He spent a great deal of time with the First Nations children who were attending school there, playing with them when he could. Father Kemis was suspicious because none of the other First Nations men in the region had reported any difficulty finding game in the region. As I said, the winter was not actually that harsh. It wasn't -40. It wasn't deep snow. Lighter snowfalls and warmer weather actually tend to lead to big, healthy deer bounding through the trees, which are easily tracked and hunted. No matter how friendly or good with kids Swift Runner was, something was off to Father Kemis. So, when Swift Runner offered to take the kids hunting, Father Kemis sent to Fort Saskatchewan out of concern. Sergeant Gagnon came back with Father Kemis, along with another officer, and questioned Swift Runner.
So Father Kemis had obviously was a missionary or a mission worker who had established a church in this area. That's accurate, right? So he had been there a while. He was familiar with the area. So seeing Swift Runner come in, the Goliath of a man that he is, with this story, he was just immediately not buying it.
Yeah, well, because he was well fed. Even the officers who came down said there was nothing. He didn't seem hungry. He didn't seem like a guy who had just barely survived the winter. He was, full cheekbones and everything.
Yeah. I mean, when someone has been starving, they look like it.
Yes. Yeah. They're
like you can clearly see it in them.
Yeah. According to other accounts, it wasn't Father Kemis who alerted the police, but rather Swift Runner's in-laws. Another account states that Swift Runner had moved to new trapping grounds that were in a rather well-stocked area with his family. It was when he moved back to his old grounds without his wife and kids, other First Nations people became suspicious. Alarmed, his wife's family alerted the police, and then Sergeant Gagnon found his camp and met up with him, and from there, the accounts converge. Regardless of who you think alerted the police, we know that it was Sergeant Gagnon who finds him, and it's Sergeant Gagnon and his assistants who take him to the campsite where the event went down.
Well, now again, correct me if I'm reaching here, but to me it seems very telltale when you mention the in-laws, because if he had moved out and he took his in-laws with him, or excuse me, his wife and children with him, and then all of a sudden he shows up without them, obviously his close family would be the first people to notice.
Exactly.
It would be. I think, and this is a loose analogy, it would be like me showing up to Thanksgiving and Christmas and all of our extended family functions, but all of a sudden my mom is missing, my brother's missing, none of them are ever showing up.
And you're not even talking about it.
Yeah, I'm not talking about it. Everything's cool.
Yeah.
And I don't look emotionally distraught.
That's going to raise some red flags.
And moreover, I'm sure in their culture there were burial rites and ceremonial kind of funeral services that would have been held in the case that they perished. But it seems as though that didn't happen. So
no.
So they're missing. He hasn't reported them dead.
No.
In my opinion, it makes more sense that it was his family that was like, "Hey, something's wrong."
It does to me too. The source where I get the the Father Kemis story is a bit more colorful, and I think it's intended that way. But I found other sources that say the same story. I found sources that say it was his in-laws. I found sources that say he turned himself in. So it's really unclear how exactly the story got to the RCMP.
Well, that too. I'm sorry, just real quick. Also take into account his in-laws obviously had to be aware of his alcoholism.
Absolutely.
Which would also serve as would serve as a means of them kind of paying close attention.
Yeah. Especially because their daughter's there.
Yeah, so he's he's an alcoholic, and all of a sudden his entire family is missing. I mean that would be a huge red flag.
And I tend to think, because some of the more serious sources I've found go with the idea that it was his family, his extended family, and his First Nations neighbors who reported him out of concern, and that there were actually rumors that he had committed cannibalism going around kind of even before the RCMP caught him. As they called it, he turned cannibal. So I tend to agree with you. I do think it was more likely the in-laws that it was this Father Kemis story. But the Father Kemis story does kind of have a bit more color to it in a lot of ways. We have a clear protagonist, if you will.
Right.
And so I think that's why it's spread around so much. It's got a clear kind of I don't know, it's just got that flavor of a film to it.
Yeah, it's almost like Shakespearean. It's dramatic,
Yeah. Here we do have another slight divergence in the story. In some accounts, Swift Runner, once he's caught by Sergeant Gagnon, he just immediately leads them to the campsite. The other accounts tend to say that he kind of tried to mislead them for a while. His story was erratic and confused, and Gagnon couldn't get him to pin down the finer details. Finally, he and the other officer decided the best course of action was to get Swift Runner to take them to the scene where it all played out. So Swift Runner, like I said, supposedly tried to mislead the officers following him, leading them down a false path. In others, he was honest and direct, led them to the grisly scene that he had created. I do think it's more likely that Swift Runner had become surly and uncooperative, because why would he want to lead the police directly there? Though not necessarily intentionally misleading the officers the way that some of the accounts say, leading them down false paths. But,
yeah, maybe like he's trying to buy time, or
exactly.
He's just trying to kind of make them run in circles.
Yeah, he's just being uncooperative. He's not purposely misleading them, but rather he's being a surly drunk. Like,
Right.
given his history of being a violent drunk, I do find it unlikely that he would just be immediately willing to reveal his crimes to the officers. Although, according to this more colorful account, it was Brazeau who was their interpreter, their Métis officer, mixed tea and chewing tobacco into a drink that he let steep overnight and then fed to Swift Runner the following morning, which apparently seemed to mellow him out and lead to him willingly leading them to the campsite. I'm going to tell you right now, don't do that. I looked it up. Ingested nicotine is super toxic.
Oh yeah.
And it could very well kill you if you ingest too much of it. And so while I've heard some smattered reports of eaten or drunk tobacco out there, most of the literature I found has basically said this will probably kill you, and if not, it will at least make you vomit horribly.
I mean, I can co-sign on this as a good old-fashioned Southern Georgia boy. There's a very popular kind of cultural trend down here when your sons, never your daughters, because women don't dip, tip of the cap. It's not womanly.
Apparently,
that's the standard down here.
Yeah.
But it's like when your sons come of age, which 20 years ago was 14 or 15.
Yeah, that's right.
Nowadays is 18 to 19. A lot of the working class men in this area either chewed or dipped.
Yeah.
And they would give their son one, and they wouldn't tell them how to do it.
Oh boy.
Right. Which is that you put it in, you chew, and you spit. You have to spit. So being a kid, what are you gonna do? You're gonna swallow it. Then all of a sudden your stomach starts burning. Then all of a sudden you get a little dizzy. You don't feel too good. And then it's basically that scene from God, I forgot the name of the movie. It was basically when they all start chewing and they go on the carnival ride.
Okay.
And everyone just starts vomiting, uncontrollably.
Yeah.
And but that's kind of like a rite of passage, and after that you learn to spit it out. But yeah, nicotine is a poison.
Yep.
Just like caffeine.
Yep.
To a certain extent, and it's also the same thing because I lived in North Carolina for a little bit, and when we had a lot of tobacco farming in North Carolina.
Oh yeah.
In Virginia, that's where you get Virginia Gold.
Yep. One
of the most popular tobaccos on earth. And when you're farming tobacco, and you won't know it because they're out there, it is 98 degrees.
Oh yeah.
And it's humid, and they're out there covered head to toe, gloves, long sleeve shirt.
Because you don't want to get
jeans,
too much of it on your
gloves.
skin.
Exactly. Even having it rub on you, can give you nicotine poisoning, which will make you pass out, and then you fall into tobacco plants, and you're getting more nicotine.
Yeah, just oozing nicotine. Yep.
And it kills you.
Yeah. Well, and Jennifer Logan is a Canadian traveler who actually died doing what they called a rainforest tobacco cleanse in Peru. So I can't attest to the veracity of Brazeau's mystical serum, but it is definitely not something you should try. I will say, if you want that sort of taste, that kind of smoky tea, you can go try some Lapsang Souchong, which is a Chinese tea that's been smoked, or Russian Caravan, which is one of my favorite varieties of tea, which is a smoked black tea. So that'll get you the taste without the nicotine poisoning.
Hey, big ups, man. Thanks for the advice.
There you go.
Just in case I want to try that out. I think I'll stick to my Limeritas, though. my Limeritas and my vaping apparatus.
I'm drinking some Empress 1908 London dry gin right now. It's got pea blossom in it that turns it very deep blue until you add tonic, where it turns purple.
That's a lot of science. That's a lot of mixology going on right there. I don't know if I trust it.
It's pretty awesome. So, in any case, Swift Runner did lead the group to the scene of the crimes. And as I said, it was a grisly one. There were bones scattered everywhere. Despite Swift Runner's story, there were 8 skulls, not 6, as you would have expected if his story had been true. Not only that...
I'm sorry. I'm sorry to interrupt you. The movie was called Sandlot. It just came flooding back to me.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
With the Beast.
I'm so sorry.
That's one of my dad's favorite movies.
The Beast. Oh yeah, the Great Bambino. Yeah, Sandlot, wonderful children's film. But yeah, in that, you remember when they get their hands on the shawl?
Yes, I do. I thought it sounded familiar.
Yeah, and they get on the ride that just spins around and around, and they're all chewing on this this huge amount of tobacco. They're sticking handfuls of it in their face, and they just vomit uncontrollably. I'm so sorry I stopped you. It just it just slapped me in the side of the face, and it was like Sandlot, the Great Bambino.
My dad would have listened to this episode, and he would have immediately been calling me if you hadn't done that.
He would have been like, Sandlot, tell him it's Sandlot. He's an idiot. It's called Sandlot. Anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt you. We're getting into the juice, the juiciness of this story.
Quite literally. So like I said, there were 8 skulls, not 6. And this is the bigger part. The teepee was still in one piece. It hadn't been stripped for food like he had claimed.
Well, so he was claiming we had to eat the leather. We stripped the TP and had to eat the leather. That's how hard up we were. And also, this is really weird too, because 8 skulls. That means
accounts for his 5 kids, his wife, his mother-in-law, and his brother.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah. Whereas he had been claiming his mother-in-law and brother had left. Which would mean that there would only be 6 skulls, because one of his children died in the woods on the hunting trip.
Oh, this is unreal.
Oh, it gets worse. So this was another big piece of evidence. The bones kind of looked how you would expect, a bit scattered by animals from being left out. But then there was one skull with children's stockings stuffed inside of it.
No.
Yeah, these weren't remains scattered by wild animals. These remains have been scattered by a person, some of them deliberately stashed. His cooking pot was still slick with fat, which is not something you find at the camp of a starving family who would have likely scraped that fat off the pot in order to eat it. You can actually still find pictures of his family's bones in the Fort Saskatchewan archives to this day. And I've linked an article to a blog where they can be found. This is when Swift Runner finally broke, though. He told them one account of what happened and admitted to killing 5 of his 6 kids and his wife. He still insisted that one child died of starvation and that his mother-in-law and brother had indeed left the camp. This was problematic. Like I said, there were 8 skulls in the camp. It's very likely that he still killed his mother-in-law and brother, but either didn't remember, or if he did remember, he wanted to deny that he had done something so heinous. One of those kind of arbitrary lines that are drawn by the guilty and haunted mind.
Right, like it's okay because this was my family, but I didn't kill my extended family.
That's right, which is so bizarre. Whatever the case, Swift Runner was brought in for trial, and though the case was damning, he was brought into trial, the case was damning, and he was sentenced to be hanged by the neck until dead. We have a few different accounts of what happened, and I'm not going to lie, this part is going to contain some gruesome and disturbing information.
So we're going to go ahead and just throw out a warning here that even though it's already been gruesome, graphic, and disturbing, it's about to get more gruesome, graphic, and disturbing.
Exactly.
Damn it! You were supposed to bring me on to talk about aliens. What's happening? but no, I'm at this point. I'm so intrigued.
It's one of those kinds of stories. And this is why I saved it for the season ender, because this is a heavy hitter. This is one of the, I think, grimmest, most fascinating parts of kind of Canadian lore that are out there. But what we're about to talk about, Swiftrunner admits to his murders and is hung at Fort Saskatchewan. But for those of you who are like me, for whom that isn't satisfying, or if you are of a more gruesome constitution, listen on. For everyone else, I'm going to provide a timestamp in the description where this section actually ends. So if you're going to skip ahead, do so now. Still with us?
I'm with you.
All right. Here's what happened according to a recollection by J.P. Turner, as collected by Morton I. Teacher in his 1962 essay, Wendigo Psychosis, as published in John Robert Colombo's collection, Wendigo, an anthology of fact and fantastic fiction in 1982.
This is so interesting because this is like a psychology journal, like like kind of a Western anthology.
Yes.
Introspection, inspection, trying to understand where basically what they're referring to, which I think is kind of apt, at least by Western means, is that this is a psychosis. This man was mentally ill and entered essentially a neurotic psychosis that is characterized by his perception that he is being possessed by an evil spirit. I just, it's so fascinating, and especially being from 1962, where even by 1962 standards, psychology as a pseudoscience was relatively new. And them trying to rationalize and understand what happens is just really interesting. Yeah, it's really interesting.
So I'm going to recite this recollection as it is written. Swiftrunner had taken the police to a little grave near his camp, saying one of his children had died and he had buried it. The grave was opened and the body was found untouched, but human bones were found scattered about the camp, among them a skull, which the Indian was not backward in confessing was that of his wife. Upon being pressed, he then readily related the details of the successive murders he had committed. He had killed his wife and eaten her. He had forced one of his boys to kill a younger brother and cut him up, and this one he had eaten. He had then killed his baby by hanging it to a lodge pole, and while at his supper had pulled the baby's legs to hasten its strangulation. In this manner he had turned for food not only to the body of his helpmate, but to his living children. He also confessed he had done away with his mother-in-law, who, he acknowledged, was a bit tough. It was said by neighboring Indians that a brother had met the same fate. What made his act even more barbarous was the fact that while he was indulging in his ghastly orgy, he had plenty of dried meat hanging around the camp. So that's our first account.
Jeez.
Yeah. It's grim. That's really bad. According to T.W. Patterson's account, which also includes the St. Albert Mission story, things went a bit differently. This account meanders a bit more, so I'll just summarize it. But Swiftrunner confessed to Father Leduc, Father Kemis's superior, that he had become ill during their hunting trip. At first, when Swiftrunner was healthy, they had plenty to eat. Swiftrunner had managed to take down some moose and bear, and they were able to gather the meat. But then, about mid-February, Swiftrunner fell ill. Worse, they started sighting fewer and fewer animals. They were forced to kill their dogs to eat them. Swiftrunner recovered a bit, hiked to the Hudson Bay Company trading post on the Athabasca River, buying some provisions and bringing them back. Then, he insisted, his mother-in-law and his brother left the camp to go hunting. He then sent his wife and all but one of their children to go find them as they continued to starve. Then, he described, an evil spirit took him over, and he shot the child, which didn't immediately kill him. Sobbing, Swift Runner then stabbed him with a knife before finally cooking and eating the boy's body. He said he even scooped the marrow from the boy's bones. Swift Runner, with renewed vigor from his cannibalistic meal, sought out his wife and kids. He found them, and they said they had been unable to locate the others, and that one of the boys had died from starvation. Swift Runner was worried that they were suspicious of what really happened when Swift Runner told them that the boy had been with him had also died of starvation. They returned to camp. He was now worried that his wife and kids were plotting to flee, so he said once again this evil spirit entered him. He killed his wife with his gun, then took his hatchet and murdered his daughters. His one remaining son he told to boil some water so they could make stew from the corpses. He said he broke the skulls to eat the brains, cracked the bones to eat the marrow. He also made his son eat from the bodies as well. Then his paranoia continued to grow. After doing some duck hunting, he grew worried that the boy would give up the act and tell people what they had done. So as they made their way back to civilization as the winter thawed, he killed and ate his last son.
Jeez.
Yep. So I'm just going to invite our listeners back now. That's as bad as it gets in this. So it's a fucked up story. I try not to swear on this podcast too often, but I mean at this point any pretense of kids listening is gone.
Yeah, there's no other way to describe that. It's incredibly macabre. It's incredibly it's sheer lunacy.
It absolutely is insane. It's a level of darkness I can't even really fathom.
Yeah, I mean that's I mean you have to be like, the only reason we're able to even talk about it and discuss this is because we're so far removed from it.
Yeah.
That, you know, it almost just seems like a bad story, and it took place so long ago that even now, you know, we can look back and talk about this, and in some ways we can kind of feel comfortable being like, well, you know, that was just then and things were different and this was just a crazy guy, and, you know, we can rationalize it all we want to, but like you said, at the end of it, this is just a terrible, terrible crime, and I am so glad they hung this guy.
No doubt. And like I said, I can't imagine a better candidate for it.
Yeah, to give a trial run.
Yeah.
Like
it's a wild story, and I can't even fathom it. And the worst part is, and T.W. Patterson knows this, Swift Runner never actually seems to get his story straight regarding what he did to his family. There were definite signs of cannibalism. There's no doubt about that. There are definite signs that he killed his family. There's no doubt about that. But he never seems to really fully admit what he did. It's like he understood he did something and he knew it was wrong, but he didn't know what he'd done.
Well, and you know, and that's, you know, maybe in his psychosis, because I mean, clearly this man was deranged. There's no question about it.
Yeah.
He doesn't show signs of being like a premeditated serial killer.
No.
There's something was off. He snapped, and we see what happened.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is seeing how he rationalizes it to himself, which oftentimes gives you a clear, you know, going back to the whole discussion of Western psychology, one of the clearest insights into what this is, what he is. It resonates in how he looks at it. And so on one hand you have that he was clearly possessed. He and maybe in his own way that's himself rationalizing it. If he's giving different accounts and saying he can't remember exactly what happened, it's one of two things. Either one, he's telling the truth, and that he is so damaged and so broken mentally that he can't remember it. or two, he's so ashamed of it, and he is so, I guess, just in a level of pure guilt and embarrassment that he can't tell us, or he can't tell what happened, because that would make it real.
Well,
it's one or the other.
I think this goes back to that alcoholism. I think that alcoholism is a huge part of his story. And because I don't think he didn't seem like a bad guy before. Basically, the accounts were, he was a violent drunk, but he wasn't, like, he didn't kill anyone. That's a big line to cross. I think between the alcoholism and the trauma. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, even then, or turn that violence. Like, so he got in some fights, okay, but turning that violence against his loved ones.
Yeah, and there had been no accounts that he had ever mistreated his family beforehand. And I think between the alcoholism and the trauma, something in him broke. And I believe he may have had a bit of an out-of-body experience while he committed these crimes. I think there's a good chance that he maybe really didn't feel in control, and it just happened.
Well, I mean, that would be analogous to, going back to a psychology point of view, which, I mean, I'm sure there are some people that would look at this and be like, yeah, he was possessed.
Yeah.
He was possessed by an evil spirit. But I mean, taking the analogy to its fullest extent, we've seen examples of this in the Western world with possession and exorcisms.
Yes. Yeah.
And things of that nature. Even though this is an entirely different culture and an entirely different spiritual backdrop, there are a lot of similarities between this account and other accounts that are more well known in essentially the Western theater of this type of just violent, murderous, cannibalistic psychosis.
Well, and what we would call this now would be a culture-bound disorder. And the thing about culture-bound disorders is oftentimes the best way to treat them is within the confines of how that culture would treat it. And like I said, he never got a cannibal song the first time he broke the taboo. And I think that was a big part of it. He never had a chance to deal with what he had done.
Well, yeah, originally when he was lost with his hunting partner.
Yeah.
And you can't, and it's like we can't fully know the extent of the damage that did to him, even subconsciously.
Well, because that was not a thing we talked about back then. And so we wouldn't have any record of it. And so it's really hard to say how much of this is trauma mixed with alcoholism, mixed with a predisposition towards maybe paranoid psychosis of some kind,
or maybe some type of schizophrenic break. I mean, some clearly some type of severe mental break.
Yeah,
that was exacerbated.
Which is interesting when you look at the T.W. Patterson account, where the first one is just this kind of urge that he gives into, and then it grows into paranoia, and that's why he commits the other murders. If you look at that account, even though that account leaves out some key details like his mother-in-law and brother, it does give you kind of an almost a more complete psychological picture where of a man who is breaking down, who is having some sort of paranoid event. It's just I wish we had answers, but it's one of those things we're probably never really going to have answers.
No, I mean, it's just a very, very old case study.
Yeah.
And the only thing we can hope to do is learn from it, like these people did in the 1960 anthology where they're composing this. Is the only thing we can hope to do is learn from this, identify the symptoms, and in some way chronicle it in a hope to one day be able to treat it more effectively. and that's the case with a lot of illnesses similar to this. And but then also on the backdrop of it, I mean, quite possibly this man could have been possessed by an evil fucking. I'm sorry, excuse my language. He could have just been possessed by an evil spirit that made him do it.
Well, yeah.
Do I think that's likely? No.
I'm a Lutheran, so in my worldview, that is a possibility. Like.
But and we see that, and I think we see that in not just in antiquity and the Christian faith, but I think in a lot of different faiths and spiritualities where they have very similar instances, things very similar like this happening, and the only explanation, the only rationalization that they can come to explain this profound abomination is that there was something otherworldly happening.
Yeah. Speaking of, Swift Runner had ostensibly converted to Catholicism while imprisoned. It is said that he actually refused to spend the night before his execution with a priest. "The white man has ruined me," he said. "I don't think their God could amount to much." Before he was hanged, Swift Runner was allowed to eat one final pound of pemmican. He then made a 5-foot drop with a sudden end.
Real quick, what is pemmican?
Pemmican is a mixture of fruit and preserved meat. It's used kind of as a trail mix.
Okay.
It was a traditional, like, trappers, hunters, fur traders would basically carry it because it kept really well.
Yeah, so it would have been like dried, salted meat.
Mixed
fruit.
with berries, often. Yeah, stuff like that.
So it's something basically the perfect thing to eat when you're out.
Exactly.
When you're out, like either when you're out hunting or running a trap line.
Exactly. That's exactly what it was for. The chiefs and Métis leaders present found nothing wrong with the hanging. There was actually one American who was present to oversee the hanging to ensure that it was done right and humanely. And he said, "Boys, it was the prettiest hanging I've ever seen."
Hell yeah. That's an American for you. Love that. That would have been me. I'd have been like, "Well, boys, this was good. We did it. Good job, everyone. Y'all ready to go get a shot of whiskey?"
Yeah, and that's how the story of Swift Runner ends. He was the Wendigo of Fort Saskatchewan.
Jeez.
Yeah. Aren't you glad you came on for this one?
Yeah, man. That's an absolutely crazy story. I had read a little into it, but I definitely wanted to dive in with you. And I've heard other people mention this story before, and I didn't realize it until we got into the meat of it. No pun intended.
Oh boy.
That this was the same story.
Yeah.
And man, oh man, what a grisly tale.
It is. I have a number of links that I'm going to be putting in the description here, including an Edmonton Journal article that was written about Swift Runner, kind of retrospective of how it was covered at the time, as well as a blog post called History Boots by a person who lives in Fort Saskatchewan and who actually went through the archives and found pictures of his family's bones as well as a picture of him chained up.
Jeez.
And he is a haunted looking man in that picture. The note on the picture.
These are basically.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, so these are basically the last surviving forensic evidence.
Yeah.
That isn't even. That's actually less evidence and more just documentation.
Exactly. What's fascinating about that picture is that all it says is Swift Runner accused of murder. Additional notes, ate his family.
Footnote. Yeah. Footnote in the fine print.
Yeah.
Also was a cannibal and cannibalized his family.
Yeah.
Jeez.
Yeah. It's. I don't know. This is just such a very Canadian tale. It involves a harsh winter. It involves that kind of conflict between the white Europeans and the First Nations people. It's a frontier story.
It's a clash of culture, a clash of environment, a clash of morals, a clash of spirituality.
Yeah.
I mean, it's Shakespearean.
It is.
It's a drama in the highest sense of the word, but it's also filled with such high strangeness.
Yes. And I thought this was just the perfect one to close out my first season on. And Blake, I just really want to thank you for coming on and making this, I think, the best show that it could have been.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So why don't you give us your pluggables?
Oh, of course, I am Blake Weatherly over at a podcast called Tap Snaps. You can find me on Twitter posting GIFs to the Kanaka Nomicon. A lot of times. We got a fun little community over there.
Yes, we do.
On Twitter. You can also find us in the Podcast Junkie Discord where we have a lot of fun. You can find us on iTunes, any platform. I'm sure the same platform Kanaka Nomicon's on, iTunes, Google Play.
Yep.
Excuse me. Stitcher.
Yep.
And it's just Tap Snaps. We do movie reviews, fun banter, current events, things like that. And hopefully we'll be able to get you on there before long.
I would love to be on.
Yeah, it'd be a lot of fun, man. Thank you so much for having me on and covering this story and helping you close out this season finale, because this was a doozy of an episode. And I really appreciate you having me on to go through this, because this was just nutso.
Yeah, before I close out, I just want to give a thanks to my wife who helped me research this episode. I also want to let you guys know that we're now on PodCoin. The PodCoin app allows you to get points that you can put towards charities or towards gifts for yourself just from listening to podcasts. And right now the Kanaka Nomicon is a bonus podcast, meaning that you get an extra half a point for every 10 minutes that you listen to our show. So that's the PodCoin app. You can find it at podcoinapp.com, I believe. It's available on Android and on Apple. So check that out. Otherwise, guys, I have a...
JR, I meant to ask you, do you have a Patreon?
I don't. I have a Ko-fi page now.
I saw the Ko-fi because I was trying to send you a beer or a coffee with whiskey in it. But yeah, also in the near future, when the Kanaka Nomicon gets a Patreon, go ahead and subscribe to that, and you'll get hidden episodes where JR will ask me about aliens, and you'll get to hear me talk about aliens for 30 minutes. So you got that to look forward to.
Yeah, that's right. I am on Ko-fi now, so that's ko-fi.com/Kanaka Nomicon. Get on over there, because the only thing I love more than alcohol is coffee, and I need that to fuel me through my research binges. So get on over there, send me a bit of cash. And
it might be a cold winter in Alberta, and he'll need a coffee to stay warm.
That's right. So I don't eat my wife.
God.
All right, guys. Thank you for joining us. Keep your eyes open. Kanaka Nomicon is a production of Crossing Clay Studios. We can be found on Twitter at Kanaka Nomicon, and you can contact us through email at kanakanomicon@gmail.com. Please be sure to share us with your friends and family, and keep your eyes open.